Steeler Fury. SteelerFury.com.
Hello and welcome again to another exciting edition of the Pittsburgh Steelers Show on the SteelerFury.com podcast. This is your host, Will Massasak, also known as Bradshaw to Ben and or Accidental Zen on Twitter. And we've got an incredible week of podcasts for you in advance of this year's NFL Draft. If you're a fan of NFL Draft content and or Steelers content, this is the week for you. We have 5 episodes we like to call the Pre-Draft Extravaganza. We'll post one per day this week. That'll be hours of podcast entertainment for you and a lot of work for us. This year's content shaping up to be great. Today we'll start with a recap of all the Steelers' offseason moves and get a feel for what needs remain for them in terms of the draft. Then tomorrow in episode 2, I will be joined by Amory Hunt to talk about my annual B2B directional state team of small school and undervalued sleepers. You won't want to miss that. In episode 3, we'll visit with podcast favorite, Steeler Fury favorite, Steel Perch, as we talk about his take on the state of the Steelers and their draft needs and possible fits for the Steelers in the 2024 draft. In episode 4, we'll have a special guest to talk. In episode 4, we'll have some special guests to talk their draft journey. In episode 4, we'll have a special guest to talk about his draft journey. And in episode 5, really the pièce de résistance for our week. Every year, we do a version of the Steelers mock war room, draft room. This is where we debate prospects and make a consensus choice on each pick in the Steelers 2024 draft. That is definitely one you won't want to miss. Always yields some interesting results, and sometimes we get it right. So without further ado, here's episode 1.
Welcome back, Steeler fans, to the SteelerFury.com podcast. I'm your host, Jeremy Kohlman. You know me as Smith is Smoking on the message boards, joined by Korey Karbowsky. You know him as Korey39. And welcome to the SteelerFury.com Draft Extravaganza, part 1 of many more to come. So be on the lookout for those others. But Korey and I, we want to dive into all the craziness that this offseason has brought us. Steeler fans, you said you wanted to change, you got to change, and they were busting moves all offseason long. But first, let's dive into probably the biggest news of the offseason is that the Steelers have done quite a bit of change on their coaching staff, namely leading with former Atlanta Falcons head coach Arthur Smith. So I hope we all enjoy not having any players of fantasy relevance on the Pittsburgh Steelers. I just want to put that out there now. You are to avoid all Steelers in fantasy draft formats ever. I don't care what rookies we take, avoid them because they will disappoint. But Korey, let's dive in on Arthur Smith here. Tell me what we can expect really with Arthur Smith now being on staff and what his offense looks like, what we, figure it to kind of unfold.
Well, first thing I want to say is, as someone who takes a lot of Steelers in my fantasy drafts, I probably should have taken that advice the last 2 years.
Right?
But, into Arthur Smith, the buzz seems to have died down about, are we going to run power and counter and all that? I'll tell you, right now, 100%, we will be running outside zone, and we will be running outside zone a lot. I'm just going to rattle through some numbers real quick. Last year, the Atlanta Falcons were number 1 in outside zone frequency. They ran it 265 times, by far the most in the NFL. The year before, they were number 1 in offensive zone frequency with 312. They ran outside zone 125 times more than the next closest team, which was the San Francisco 49ers. So we are going to be running outside zone on first down, second down, third down, every quarter, every game. You're going to see outside zone. just some other things that kind of pop out. Second to last in inside zone. So it's not just a zone team, it's an outside zone team. Big distinction there. Outside zone. He runs duo a little bit, last in power frequency, second to last in counter frequency. Now, some of the things that people know. Number 1 in 12 personnel. That's 1 running back, 2 tight end. So everyone should buckle up for a heavy dose of Darnell Washington. Either a Michael Pruitt, Connor Hayward. We'll probably discuss that a little bit more once we get to the acquisitions period. The pass game, pretty chalk. Not too much going on there. Runs, play action, not any higher of a rate than anyone else just because he runs the ball so much. But you get a lot of mesh, short, attacks in the middle of the field, get some verticals, get some screens. Now, and it probably goes with our offseason of not signing wide receiver 2 and trading away our current wide receiver 2. Dead last in wide receiver usage. Dead last, Jeremy. I mean, do you have any comments on him being 32nd in wide receiver usage this last year?
I will preemptively say, because I don't want to go too far into the podcast, that unfortunately that fits our roster to a T at the moment.
Yeah.
So, as far as that goes, I'm a little disappointed just because, I'll be honest, I kind of wanted to bring in, Zach Robinson, who's actually with the Falcons. He was a Sean McVay, disciple of offense. That's kind of the offense I really wanted moving forward, very run friendly, wide receiver friendly, just make sure you block and, the options are there. But, I wasn't so against the Arthur Smith hire, but I wasn't the biggest fan of it at the time. I'll just go ahead and put that out there, but there's no use crying over spilled milk. It's either going to last or it's going to spoil. So we'll see how Arthur Smith does here.
It definitely seems like, it was a hire that Tomlin wanted to fit his image of an offense. With Atlanta played behind a lot, and they ran the ball more than any other team, and they passed the ball less than any other team. They're first in run tendency and 32nd in passing tendency. It's going to be a heavy dosage of passes to the tight ends. They're number 1 in passes to the tight end this last year, even with Kyle Pitts being lackluster in fantasy, which Jeremy had last year, if I recall.
Yeah.
Running back usage, so that's going to come naturally with running the ball a lot. Some short little dump downs. But yeah, it's going to be an outside zone team. They're going to run the ball early and often. That's how they're going to want to win games. But as we transition into we can do that in a second. Do we have any other coaching changes before we transition to personnel a little?
Yeah, so quite a change up as far as coaches go. Not only an offensive coordinator, have a new quarterbacks coach in Tom Arth, new wide receivers coach, which we called for the firing of the past one, whose name is escaping me at the moment.
Frisman, I want to say.
Yeah, Frischman. Maybe Isaiah Frischman. But anyway, in the past, don't care anymore. So bring on Zach Azani, who has had some success in the league. Defensively, we brought on an assistant secondary coach by the name of Anthony Midget. The only reason I wanted to bring that up was just because it'd be fun to say midget on this show. So that's nothing against him. Just thought it'd be a little fun little anecdote to add. But the other thing that's interesting to me is, we did some changes, more even off the field than that. Pastor, the former strength and conditioning coach, after 23 years said, he was ready to move on. So the Steelers have a new strength and conditioning coach and former Boston College strength coach, Phil Matus. Who I believe has some Pittsburgh area ties. I can't remember exactly if he's a Pittsburgh native or just has ties, but it wasn't just offensive coordinator. They went out there and, changed quite a few faces. So it'll be interesting to see how those guys, develop in their roles and everything. So, but yeah, you hit the nail on the head. Let's get into personnel here. What can we realistically expect since, an Arthur Smith offense wants to run the ball? How are the running backs going to be used? Because every fantasy manager out there can tell you that, Bijan Robinson was not the fantasy dynamite they thought, he was going to be, splitting time with Tyler Algier. They threw the ball more to Johnny Smith, who was their third tight end than I think anyone in the league. So, like you said, how do you think our roster translates, into that? How does Najee and Jalen Warren look in this type of offense?
Yeah, so, one of the big things that I've been concerned about since the beginning of the offseason is that objectively, Najee Harris and Jalen Warren were not good outside zone runners last year. Jalen Warren was a very poor outside zone runner, and Najee Harris was poor, but not as poor. It was two bad outside zone runners. So, there's been some rumblings that Najee's losing some weight, so I'm sure that might play a little part of that. But one thing I wanted to say is, there's a bit of a misconception out there about Arthur Smith's offense. And, my personal thoughts on it, I think it's a very Tomlin move. I think it's going to lead to some Tomlin-type results. I don't think it's a very vicious hire. But, Kyle Pitts, you could argue that he should have more than the 9th most targets amongst tight ends. But he had 90 targets last year, and there were reports that he was playing through injuries. Bijan ended with 214 rush attempts. So the way you have to think about it is, yes, Bijan was giving a lot of carries to someone else, but they ran the ball so damn much that he still ended with over 214 carries still. So I think that's where, how much could a running back really take? When you're running the ball almost 400 times a year, you can only run the ball with one back so much is kind of my point of view on it. So, if we're looking long term, I would kind of expect Jalen Warren to, look to improve on his wide zone carries. I mean, I'm not sure we're going to speculate here, but there have been some unverified rumors that the Steelers are not looking to be with Najee for much longer, and even explored some trades with him. Grain of salt, just some people talking on Twitter about what they've heard from a source who knows someone, all this kind of backdoor AD stuff. But, when we get to our drafting, that is something I'm going to point out. When we talk about a running back, I mean, what about Cordarrelle Patterson? That's an addition. Or is he a running back? Is he a receiver? What's kind of your stance on that, Jeremy? Or is he, just both?
I think he's I think he's firmly a running back at this point in his career. I don't think he quite has the separation ability that he showed earlier in his career. He's an older guy, so I mean that's reasonable to expect. He's not quite as quick as he was, but let's go ahead and dive into the kind of the signings of this offseason and how it's going to fit with Arthur Smith. Obviously Cordarrelle Patterson has been with Arthur Smith the last 2 years. I like the signing just because it's not like we've boasted this extremely deep running back room over the last few years outside of Najee and Jalen. So I like the fact that, he's a guy that brings experience. He knows what an Arthur Smith offense is going to look like. He can still catch passes out of the backfield. That's, just an attractive part. I don't know the stats on this, but I mean, Tyler Algier and Bijan Robinson caught quite a bit of balls out of the backfield. I think there were at least 40 receptions by the running back room last year. So, I mean, I would expect that to be kind of on par just because we used Jalen Warren in a lot of that, kind of the last year. Even Najee, to an extent, got his opportunity. So you might see a slight increase there, a slight not. But I think Cordarrelle Patterson's a running back. He brings experience to the room. And a true pro's pro. Not to mention, with the new kickoff rule, and everything, he kind of brings this interesting kick return dynamic to that. And for those of you that aren't familiar, the NFL is, has this new kickoff rule, very XFL-like, to where kicks have to be downed or, put in a zone between the 20 and the, end zone. They have to be fielded and they have to be returned. There's no fair catch anymore. No just bringing out to the 25, anything like that. I think if it goes to, I'll reference our expert special teams man in the room, but correct me if I'm wrong, but if it hits the end zone, doesn't the ball come out to the 30?
I believe it might be the 35. And I think if you hit it out, it might be the 45. So I know that there's a punishment for, letting that ball leave the zone that they want it to be in.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. But just so you know, Patterson brings some ability there as well. So, but well, let's dive, since we're kind of in the acquisition phase now. Well, luckily, you know, the Steelers also got to say bye to a lot of names this year. By Mitchell Trubisky, by everyone in the quarterback room. Let's just preface that now. It's a completely new room. Wade Presley Harvin, we're done with that experiment. And very Steeler-esque. Our biggest move to start free agency, we signed a punter. All right, Cameron Johnston. That, like, you know, we were all kind of waiting for that big free agency move. What did the Steelers do? Let's go sign a punter. And that's nothing against Cameron Johnston, because he's a good punter, don't get me wrong. But that's just like the irony of what Pittsburgh Steelers fans want. It's like, let's go get someone that can really improve this roster in offensive output. No, we're going to go with the punter. So, but he's a good punter. But then we also said goodbye to some other names. One that I briefly have to touch on because it still pisses me off to this day. The fact that we just outright cut Okorafor at tackle still pisses me off to this day. You're telling me we couldn't get a 6th-round pick for him? Like, that still drives me up a wall. In a draft, especially in the last few drafts where it's like we're always saying, man, we could really use one more draft pick, you know? Nice job, Steelers. I understand we're saving, you know, the $8.75 million and everything, but give me a break. We could have got a pick somewhere for that and still saved $8.75 million, but I digress. I'm going to get off my soapbox.
Well, I could say something about Chucks.
Yeah.
You know, look, and they're rookies coming up in this draft class. All these tackles are rookies, but you can't tell me that one of these young QBs couldn't benefit from the level of pass protection that Chucks provides, because the level of pass protection he'll provide as a 4th or 5th year pro is basically guaranteed to be better than whatever you get from a first-year rookie. So you can't tell me that one of these young quarterbacks couldn't have benefited from a good pass protecting right tackle who played left tackle in the past, by the way. That was something I'd mentioned before. But you can't tell me that someone couldn't have thrown us any picks for it. Like, it feels like we didn't ask in this situation. That's what it feels like.
Yeah. I think it was one of those situations, you know, there was that rumor mid-season, you know, that Korafor basically said that the offense couldn't do anything and we should kneel something out when they were down by like 10 points in the 4th quarter or something, that firmly planted his ass on the bench and not in the future of this team. But I digress. I mean, he ended up going to New England where they're going to draft a quarterback, Korey, like you said. It's just frustrating.
It was ironic because you remember only a couple weeks later, Tomlin decided to just run the ball out down about the same amount of points with about 5 minutes left.
Yeah.
But we didn't have time, so we couldn't make a big deal about it. We weren't sure the reasons of a Korafor's yet.
Mm-hmm. But other moves, especially releases that we did, we released Mason Cole, which we'll definitely talk more about here in a little bit when we come up on needs. We released safety Keanu Neal, wide receiver Allen Robinson, who the rumor was we were just trying to get to take a pay cut, and he was just like, nope. And then we were just like, whatever, that's fine with us. Patrick Peterson, no longer back. So with that, let's get into more of the signings. Kind of like I alluded to, Cameron Johnson brought in to be our new punter. Will be much more consistent than what Presley Harvin was. So let's discuss the next big one here. And I'm still not sure I'm quite on board with it. The trade for, or the trade between, more than anything, we traded a Deontay and got a Dante. This one I still don't get, just because I think, obviously, you know, the trade I'm alluding to is that we sent Deontay Johnson to the Panthers for Dante Jackson, the corner. I was not a big fan of this just because I don't like taking away guys that have been ultra productive. I understand, you know, he's in the last year of his contract, so we probably weren't going to be extending him. But I don't like taking guys off the board who catch touchdowns for for a guy who I think is just a marginal corner at best. So Korey, what are your thoughts on that?
So me and you see this a bit differently. This is one of those things where, and I'm sure you agree with this aspect. This is the kind of trade where you have to look at what happened in totality in the offseason and after the draft and see how we address the receiver room and all that. Because, the return itself, I don't hate. And I think it's because I like Dante Jackson a little more than you.
Okay.
But, he's strictly an outside corner, so let's say that. And I looked at it. I looked at some numbers, and I think it was Joey Porter Jr. played majority of his snaps on, I believe, it was the right or left. Really doesn't matter. It was one side, though. There were some games where he followed someone, but majority of his snaps played on the right or left. That's how NFL corners do it. Dante Jackson played all of his snaps the last bunch of years opposite side of him. So you can tell they're already, they probably looked at him. They saw him as a good fit. But by the numbers, he's one of the top man cornerbacks in the NFL. Now, outside of those man snaps, it's bad. He's not a good zone corner at all. Just not.
Gotcha.
But we talked about this a couple times in our group messages. Kind of, we'll touch on it more with guys like Patrick Queen and how we're going to call the defense and all that. But if we are running a lot of man, Dante Jackson's going to look like a solid corner at minimum because he's been a good corner for years. Now, my view on this trade can change depending on what we do in the draft. And if we roll into the NFL season with a Quez Watkins or Van Jefferson as our second best receiver. So that's why, you kind of have to look at a trade like this after everything's kind of tied itself together because you're not sure what the long game is. But as of right now, assuming we address receiver and get something decent in the draft, could we have gotten more? I would think so, but I like Dante Jackson, and I don't love him, I'll say that, but I do like him as a corner, and especially if we are going to run a lot of man, I think it's going to be a pretty decent deal, at least.
Yeah, I mean, and I'll be honest, I was more disappointed just because I thought Deontay Johnson, was a good receiver. His metrics as far as getting open have been like the first in the league the last 5 years, and so that's the part I hate about trading out.
And what's weird is like you saw we got Chase Claypool on 32nd overall pick. I know it was a second round pick and it went up to the 32nd or the 33rd, but we got Chase Claypool off our hands for a second rounder. Dante Jackson and a sixth rounder, I believe the pick was. That's not worth even that Chase Claypool return, even at the time, that's not a Deontay Johnson return. So, I would have liked more, but something's telling me either the league doesn't like him, they don't like the body language and the drops. Because, I'm not just assuming that, we took a worse deal than some of the others we could get. I mean, we took what we had to offer or what we got offered. But, like you were saying, I got to see how we address it in the draft because that was a separator by our company. And, Deontay Johnson was a top 5 separator by every single metric. You would just imagine that we would be able to get something that would be more than what we got for Chase Claypool, or at least around that. We all know we got a steal in the Chase Claypool trade. But,
right.
Look at it after the draft, see what the whole plan was, because, we walk out with like an A.D. Mitchell or Xavier Legette. It looks a lot worse all of a sudden. But
yeah, and especially, you see the Stephon Diggs trade here of late where, it's like they basically got a second rounder for him. And it's like, man, like we couldn't have found anything else, a little closer to that. Obviously, it's in me, especially this time of the year, to be greedy, and wanting more picks and everything, especially higher in the draft. But it is what it is. I don't want to sit here and harp on it all day because I probably could and be that type of fan, but I'm not going to because we still have a lot more to get to. Namely, you kind of mentioned it. We brought in a few other, wide receivers. We brought in Quez Watkins over from the Eagles, Van Jefferson. Hey, another Falcon. Imagine that. Re-signed a guy like Montravius Adams. But two of the bigger defensive signings before we really get into the room that got a complete revamp. Bring in Patrick Queen over from the hated rival Baltimore Ravens, and then Deshaun Elliott, who came up from Miami. Let's kind of talk about what those two are going to bring. My first initial thoughts on the Patrick Queen trade were, I hate it. I'm not going to lie. I thought we overpaid for him. But upon further look at how the contract is set out, there's not a ton of guaranteed money in there. So if for some reason it wouldn't pan out, we can get out. But let's kind of talk about him. Though the one nice thing about him, Korey, is he's only 24 years old. I had no idea he was still that young. So kind of talk about what Patrick Queen brings to the table.
Yeah, I was actually a really big fan of him when he was coming out of LSU. Kind of, once he was drafted as a Raven, I was like, damn it. But he had 3 bad years with them.
Yeah.
He really turned it around this last year. He's solid in the run game, solid tackler. So, nothing spectacular against, when stopping the run. The interesting part of Queen's profile is that he is bad in zone coverage, which for a linebacker kind of makes you raise an eyebrow. Mm-hmm. But he is the best blitzing linebacker in the league. So, we had talked about this a little. And the way and I wasn't a fan of it either. There were a lot of other guys I'd rather have had. But the way you could sell me on this is if we want to return to a more heavy third down blitzing, kind of style defense, press man, make the quarterback have to evade and, make a throw, beating your guys for good and man. Because Landon Roberts basically has the same profile as Patrick Queen. And Landon Roberts was probably a better player than Patrick Queen last year. Now, that's not really a slight to Patrick Queen in and of itself. Landon Roberts was good. It just seems a little redundant with the signing, and I'm sure you agree. But, again, we got to see what their plan is. If they're going to sit there and drop Landon Roberts and Patrick Queen back and play, 7 deep on third downs, this is going to look bad. It's not going to look great. Patrick Queen's not that kind of player. Landon Roberts is that kind of player. But if we want to kind of veer from the status quo of defenses right now and, play press man and force these quarterbacks to get the ball out quick and, have our linebackers go and be running backs and tight ends and pass coverage, it could be a pretty good defense with what we have as long as we utilize those pieces.
Yeah, I'd say one of the bigger things that stood out to me is it took Patrick Queen getting Roquan Smith next to him for the best of him to come out. So, I don't want to harp on it and say, hey, we got the linebacker that shouldn't have been paid because he's a good player. Don't get me wrong, but I just have my hesitancy or whatever. It's like when teams have to account for Roquan Smith, Patrick Queen is a lot more available to go do what he wants. It's like we don't have another Roquan Smith. We essentially signed him to be our Roquan Smith. A guy who can be a perennial all-pro linebacker, especially with the type of contract we gave him, which, again, is not as bad as what it seemed to be initially, just with how it's laid out and everything. But that was kind of my initial thing. It's like, man, it seems like we're getting the running mate of the best arguably the best linebacker in the league. So that's kind of where I fell on it. Let's pivot to Deshaun Elliott. Elliott's more of I'm glad we finally got what I think is a true strong safety for this defense. It feels like we've been lacking that for the last few seasons to really complement Minkah. So what does Elliott bring to the table that will help round out this defense a little more, Korey?
I think it's just competency is the main thing,
Competency. We set the bar really high.
Going to look good when, no offense to Trent Thompson, he didn't play bad, but that's what we had to turn to by the middle of the season. Keanu Neal and physical at the end of the year. We barely saw him because he is often injured. What this signing kind of reminds me of, because Elliott's, true strong safety, but he can bounce around a little. He'll play a little in the box. He'll play a little free safety. he can, and we're not doing that for Deshaun Elliott. We're going to be doing that so we can move Minka where we want to move Minka. But it's just nice to have a guy who can be on the field and you don't have to go and switch personnel or anything like that. I think that he's going to be better than what we had. He's a hard hitter, so that's fun. He kind of reminds me of what we thought Kazee would be when Kazee was signed. And Kazee showed spurts of that where, he can play a little free safety, play a little strong safety, play a little nickel, play down in the box. But I think the difference is Deshaun Elliott's, didn't have, as many health issues before. Hopefully won't have the injuries that Kazee's had while he's been here. And it doesn't hurt, even if Kazee comes back to form, it doesn't hurt having two guys that can bounce around a little and spot each other and, that kind of thing. So there were other safeties. Again, I was a huge Rayshawn Jenkins fan. I thought he would have been a really good fit. But I think Deshaun Elliott's a solid player. I think he's going to be better than what we had. So it's hard to complain about a signing like that,
Well, especially for the type of contract we signed him to, too. I think it was a 2-year, $6 million deal. So we're not paying him a whole lot. We essentially said, we're going to take the money we had for Keanu Neal and we're going to move it to a younger, better guy. So, and let's face it, for every Troy Polamalu out there, we need a Ryan Clark. So, if he can be, on the Ryan Clark level of complimenting Minka Fitzpatrick, that could turn into a very good thing. Ryan Clark is probably one of my more favorite Steelers, that people don't really talk about a whole lot. But boy, that guy could hit too. So that's kind of the first thing I thought of, not to mention Deshaun Elliott, meet Derrick Henry again like you've done before, please.
Yep.
So definitely need that with the Ravens signing a big back like Henry. So, but let's dive into the room that I could not have seen a more drastic change from us running this story about how we are totally on board with Kenny Pickett and he's our starter and we're confident in him, to none of y'all are going to come back this year. Mitchell Trubisky wanted out. That was the first move of the offseason, actually, was Trubisky getting cut and then ironically going right back to Buffalo. Boy, if we could rewind the time and not live through that again. Then obviously the big trade for Justin Fields, which ironically wasn't that big. But just getting Justin Fields, boy, especially after getting Russell Wilson on the non-existent contract that he signed to play here for. So, let's just start from the top. Obviously, the big news, Russell Wilson gets signed. Kenny Pickett says, fuck that, I'm out. He was just like, I ain't about it. Then we go out and trade for Justin Fields, too. I was thinking, boy, this could be not more radically different than what the Pittsburgh Steelers have ever planned at quarterback in my lifetime. And I get it. I'm a younger guy. Korey's a younger guy. We haven't been through some of the Neil O'Donnell type stuff, from back in the day. So we can't fall back. Yeah, same here for the most part. So we can't fall back on that. I remember a little bit of Cordell Stewart, so don't shoot me too hard. But and then even rounding out the room by signing Kyle Allen. Korey, take us away here. Russell Wilson coming over, definitely didn't see that. What is he bring at this point in his career? Because I think that's the biggest question is, what are we really getting at this stage in his career?
One of the first things we have to look at, and you mentioned it, for signing him for the dollar amount that we did because of Denver's competency, it's a win in and of itself. He could be horrible, and it really wouldn't matter. We're paying him nothing. So, but when looking at the fit, I think it's a really good fit. I'm sure we'll discuss projections closer to the season and everything. It kind of falls in the thing with Arthur Smith and Russell Wilson and Mike Tomlin's philosophy in general. I think at this point in the AFC, you're going to need someone's quarterback or two people's quarterbacks to get injured to beat them if you don't have one of your own. So I don't think that fixes this. I think if everything goes right, and I mean everything, Russell Wilson could lead this team to potentially a Super Bowl. But, he's not going to go out there and win a duel with Patrick Mahomes or Josh Allen or probably even Lamar. We're going to have to win, with other methods. So I like the signing. it takes away some of his flaws. A lot of his issues are taking those sacks, especially early in the downs. But we're going to be running the ball. So that's not really going to be that big of an issue for us. I'm not going to downplay field position, but taking a sack on 3rd and long is a completely different situation from taking a sack on 1st and 10 or 2nd and 5, which, with how much we're going to run the ball, that's going to be more so what happens, where it's going to be, okay, Russ, 3rd down, go make something happen, which is when he's been at his best in his career, when it's, back against the wall, go do something. We're not going to see many over the middle throws. It's never been a facet of his game, which is weird with 2 tight ends, but I'm sure we'll see a lot of crossers and meshes and all that stuff. I think George Pickens is going to love this signing because even at his old age, Russell Wilson still throws a top 3 go ball in the NFL. Yeah. He puts that thing, guys, you can track that thing the whole way down. I think if George Pickens is the only receiver on the field, you've got a good option every play to just throw it up to him. Russell Wilson can still throw a deep ball. I think there is a little bit of blend with DK Metcalf and George Pickens' skill set. It's not, 1 for 1, of course, but I think there is a bit of a blend where that's the same type of physical receiver that Russ knows how to throw to. Same thing with Sutton. When Sutton was healthy, he had some good stretches in Denver. So I think he'll be productive. I don't think we'll see a comeback year from Russ because I don't think he's really going to throw a ton of balls. But it's definitely better than Kenny. I mean, that's kind of the viewpoint you have to have on it.
Yeah, so not to cut you off there, but that was my next point. At least Russell Wilson's passes find the end zone.
Mm-hmm.
And ironically enough, if you look at just statistics from last year, his year statistically was better than Patrick Mahomes. He either beat him or tied him in touchdowns, had less interceptions. And he didn't end up playing like the last 3 or 4 games because the Broncos were trying those shenanigans with him not taking the injury guarantee part of his contract and all that, to which the NFLPA, came back and said, screw you, we will sue your ass if you try that shit again. But, at least this is a guy that actually knows how to find the end zone with his throws. That's kind of my biggest takeaway is at least we have a guy that knows that it takes 6 to win.
And what exciting. So there's kind of 2 things. So one, Russell Wilson, he's a little bit of a weirdo in the locker room, but he is a leader. And that's the thing. He's a little weird, but he is a leader, which I think the offense Mason Cole was the damn leader last year. And Najee Harris, who went to the media whining after every other game about various things. I mean, there were no good leaders Deontay Johnson, clearly not a leader. George Pickens wasn't blocking. It was a kind of a theme of last year's offense. And so that's one thing. I think the other thing for me, and this is probably the biggest factor and why I do have a little more optimism than, what Russell Wilson specifically is as a player. I think he's really going to go out there and prove something. There's a reason he signed for Bettman. There's a reason that he was going to a slightly more established team like the Steelers, where he knew he's going to have to compete with Kenny before Kenny got all whiny upset about it. But he was willing to go and compete because he probably felt really slighted about how Denver handled that situation.
No doubt.
Right or wrong, getting called the worst contract or one of the worst contracts, thanks to Sean Watson, one of the worst contracts in NFL history. So I think that we're probably going to see the best version of Russell Wilson that we have in probably 3 or 4 years, in addition to the fact that he's going to be asked to do less. So I think it is a good blend. It's a good agreement for all parties involved. But it still comes down to, can you beat Patrick Mahomes? Can you beat Josh Allen? Can you beat Lamar? And that's the question of, we just don't know if that's really the ceiling of this team yet.
Sure. And then let's dive right into the thing that just completely shocked me to my core. Not only the fact that we go out and trade for Justin Fields, the fact that we only traded a 6th round pick, which we can become a 4th, I think, or something, is just mind numbing to me. And obviously this was, before Kenny Pickett threw his little tantrum of hey, I'm not going to stay here and compete, which is the biggest joke in the world since he's going to not compete with Jalen Hurts. It's not like he's going to be challenging for playing time there. Anyway, bye, Kenny. I'm glad we don't have to talk about you anymore. We could go on all day again. But to get Justin Fields for as little as we did, I understand we have to make a decision about a 5th-year option, which I highly doubt we pick up at this point, just because I think it's $25 million guaranteed. It's not quite that in cash value, but he is immensely more talented than anyone we've had in a backup role for the last few years. And there's even some rumors that, if Russ wouldn't look good to start training camp, the rumors are out there that, Fields could assume a starting job at some point early if things were to not go well. But I'm thrilled with the addition of Justin Fields. One, I think he kind of fits Arthur Smith offense well, kind of what you alluded to. But, man, just the overall talent, we haven't had that type of talent at the quarterback position in a long time.
Yeah. The thing with Justin Fields, I think you're right. I don't think we pick up the 5th year. My guess, and this isn't, anything I've seen. This isn't any rumors. This is just, me kind of predicting. I would assume that mid-season we get something along the lines of a 2-year extension with a team option or even a player option. It really doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Where there's a ton of incentives thrown in where, maybe Russ looks good. And then maybe Fields and Russ hit it off and they want to get, and he's like, you know what? I'll wait it out. Steelers start telling me the job's mine after. Maybe it's 3 years. If that's the case, then just tag on a year to my hypothetical. But my guess is that we extend him to something short and we're going to know what he looks like. Everyone else won't, but everyone inside the staff, everyone inside the front office will. And he's uber talented. I mean, I find it hard to believe that we're going to pass that up for, what could a rookie who could be, less talented. You might as well just, take a stab at it with Fields. I'm of the opinion that we should probably ride it out with Wilson, kind of see how Fields looks in practice and everything. Draft a rookie. This is going to be a massive quarterback class next year. I know people say it isn't good. Me and Will have a different opinion on that. But that way you would have, maybe another year of Russell Wilson, a rookie to sit behind. I think something that'll be really good for Fields. I mean, he was in that hellhole that was Chicago. Like, that was a disaster for improvement, for any growth. And I'm not going to absolve him of everything. He's been a shaky decision maker. He's been, inaccurate at times. But being behind a guy like Russell Wilson is the exact kind of quarterback that you'd want to be behind in his situation. Right now, you just kind of got to eat your losses the last 2-3 years, learn, and then hopefully next year or the year after, depending on what happens with Wilson, you can see what he has to offer after that extension.
Yeah, I'd be on board with that. But honestly, the biggest thing I love is just how athletic he is. We haven't had an athlete like that at quarterback since, the lesser version of Mike Vick showed up, So I love the fact that he can run. Honestly, I love what he can do for an offense just because of his legs. Getting him almost signifies a potential move to like a more progressive style of offense. I love the ability that he can create with his legs. I think that's a huge underrated part of what the NFL gets at quarterback anymore. So I love what he could do. I'd love for him to sit and become like a Jordan Love, because he was very young when he was drafted. Let's say he sits this year, maybe another with Russell Wilson, and then can like take on a Jordan Love type of, progression. Because I'll be honest right now, I would trade Russell Wilson for Jordan Love in a heartbeat. I loved how Jordan Love finished down the stretch. He finished phenomenal, finally found his stride. And I was not a Jordan Love fan of his coming out, but I mean, the sitting for all those years and now playing at a high level, I mean, that I'd be thrilled with that. And then last but not least, let's throw in Kyle Allen. He's a proven backup in the league. You could do a far lot worse. But my big thing is in the pre-draft visit of Michael Penix still baffles me to a degree. because he's the only one we've apparently met with as far as pre-draft 30 visits go. Really don't want the Steelers drafting a quarterback at any point this year, since it feels like that room's been solidified. Even if it's for the short term, it's like, let's not waste our time with a late round developmental guy.
Yeah, it seems like you've got the kind of, I mean, this is the kind of quarterback room that I know Will's been banging on the table for forever. Maybe not the specific players, and maybe not as old as Justin Fields is, and he's not old, but just, giving an example. But where you've got your veteran, you've got a highly talented backup who you're hoping turns into something, and then you've got someone to keep the ship going if everything goes wrong. You've got someone who can just, keep you alive, win a game if you're already up. Like that's basically all you're asking for out of that third guy. As much as I would like to take a stab on, a developmental guy, which there aren't a ton of in this draft, Kyle Allen probably puts us in a better position to win than having, a Joe Milton that we took in the 6th round if the wheels fall off. So I get it. This is probably how a QB room should be built. It just doesn't make much sense to add to it, especially this year. You got to see what you have in the house with Fields, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Just 2 more minor signings. We'll go into it since we've kind of talked about Michael Pruitt. He's another tight end / fullback. My only thing at the time was I felt like we had that with Connor Hayward, but Pruitt's better, as to what Korey and Will tell me.
I mean, there was a lot of uproar when Pruitt got signed about, we already have Connor Hayward. We like Connor Hayward. I think he's a solid player, but I mean, he hasn't done much in the league. He's not an exceptional blocker. He's solid with the ball in his hands, but I mean, Michael Pruitt is a lot better blocker. He's close to as good with the ball in his hands, probably better move blocker. My guess is that Connor Hayward ends up on our practice squad, which, I'm more than fine with. I'd like to keep him. But, I was just kind of laughing when the signing happened and people were talking about how we had a third tight end. It's like, well, Michael Pruitt is much more of a true tight end and H-back than Connor is. Connor's more of like a gadgety slot, like halfback kind of type, whereas Cordarrelle Patterson, I think, is going to fill a lot of that role. So I'd be pretty surprised if Connor Hayward's on the roster to start the year.
Yeah.
But
even in Cam Hayward's last year, we're not going to keep him happy by keeping the brother on the roster.
Signing of Russell Wilson kind of shows that we want to win,
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. And then just some a re-signing and an additional signing for the D-line. Montrevious Adams was brought back, on a small deal, nothing guaranteed. So his spot's not assured, but he's given us some quality snaps here and there, type of deal. And then went out and signed Dean Lowry actually to a 2-year, $5 million deal as well. They essentially have the exact same contract. Another depth guy more than anything. So, I think they've filled kind of the defensive holes for the most part as far as defensive line goes. Obviously, I think we'd like a little bit more talent with that group.
Sure, well, in the draft section, maybe a little.
Yeah, so and that's kind of what I want to pivot to.
Well,
or anyone else I'm missing?
I want to get one little special teams note in so I can be on record saying this before it happens. I don't think this year. So we signed Matthew Wright, kicker out of UCF again. You guys might remember. Been in and out, UCF kicker. He's kind of always with us. Whenever you see these constant signings of a guy, that's kind of a precursor that whenever Boswell either gets cut because of money or kind of starts to croak, doesn't look as good, that's going to be the guy. And I want to be on record saying that over the recent years in the NFL, it's been more punters, but it's happened with kickers too. It has not been uncommon for proven vets who are good, but just starting their downtrend and where you think the contract might not be worth the production you're getting, for a team to sign a guy like Matthew Wright, where it's going to be vet men. And I'm not going to predict it's going to happen this year. How? If it does happen this year, which I think there's a non-zero chance of it happening because I saw them sign him again, which is like the 8th time we've signed him. I would like to have my name across putting that out.
All right, Korey Karbowsky putting it on.
Also predicted, not publicly, that we would sign an Aussie punter, which I was correct on.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Johnson's an Aussie. I forgot about that. But, I mean, just briefly touching on that, he signed a 4-year, $20 million deal back in 2022. So, this will be the third year of his contract where he's worth 4.72 against the cap this year, same next year, and then just 4.82 the next. So, I don't know. I mean, I think Boswell would have to be pretty bad for us not to honor the contract because he's been absolute money, when we've needed for the most part.
That's the good thing for a lot of these teams. I think the only difference is that the Steelers are a bit more of the hometown guys who have been here for a while. But, like Thomas Morstead, when he got cut from the Saints, again, punter examples more often with the punter. Thomas Morstead's still a top 8 punter in the league. He's punting with the Jets. But big contract, or big for a specialist, and they cut him. So that's just something to, over the next 2 years, I would say just kind of keep an eye on that, especially if Boswell starts to look a little shakier, which I think we saw slight signs of that this year where he wasn't as automatic on kickoffs and, field goals and extra points as he has there.
Yeah, well, he might not have to worry about the kickoffs anymore. So,
well, that is one thing I'm curious, because I follow Matthew Red on Twitter. I've snapped with him before, and the day that they made the UFL kickoff announcement, or the new kickoff announcements, because he'd been in those smaller leagues, posted a rolling video of him doing all sorts of different kicks. So, that is something that's interesting. Some guys who've typically done kickoffs, I'd imagine the punter types will have more issue transitioning, but kickers, that's basically kickoff field goal steps that they're doing. But enough special talk. I've dragged us off into that tangent.
Well, and we've talked about who we've cut, who we've brought in. Now it's time to kind of take a look at the roster, and there are some massive holes. Even in an Arthur Smith offense. So let's talk about the glaring one, if you ask me. The biggest one out there is the lack of talent in the wide receiver room. After trading Deontay Johnson away, after bringing in, just some average NFL types in a Quez Watkins and a Van Jefferson, we're basically rolling out George Pickens. There's really no one else in the room. I mean, Calvin Austin, was a marginal contributor at best. Mm-hmm. You're talking about everyone who's worth mentioning. I'll say this: Marquez Callaway has bounced around and been semi-productive when he's hit the field, but he's not this great athlete that some, none of these guys are. Former first-round receiver Denzel Mims, who's been bouncing around every practice squad known to man. Wide receiver is a pretty big need.
Yeah. I mean, you could argue we don't even have a wide receiver 3 compared to most. But it's assumption.
So, I mean, what do you take stock into all these things about, Pittsburgh still could trade for, make a big splash in the wide receiver market. Brandon Ayuk's been brought up. Andrew Filipponi brought up T. Higgins the other day. I just want to shoot him in the leg. That's like a mercy kill. What a dumb thing to put out there. But
so here's my point of view on it. And it's, maybe a more modern, or maybe an old school way of looking at a trade. But, my question is the value out of the second rounder that we're going to get this year, and maybe even like a 5th rounder next year, let's pretend it's a 6th rounder and a next year's 5th. Are the value of those players more likely, including contracts, going to outperform what we get out of Brandon Ayuk plus an extension over the next 6 years? My guess would be no. I mean, he's a better player than what we get. I mean, yeah, you have a chance of getting a Puka Nacua, but you can't assume that. That's not how the draft works. You're just looking at average values. Most fifth rounders never start. Second round's dicey. Second round's always been dicey. A lot more than people think, actually. And so I would definitely – now I don't know what San Francisco's demanding. They could be asking for 2 seconds. They could be asking for 1st and a 3rd. You never know what they're asking. But me personally, if it's, a second and a fifth, maybe Omar Khan's good with that, maybe he's not. But I think if you're going to get more value out of a player, even with the contract extension, especially when you don't have a long-term QB signed right now, I think that value is going to outweigh the potential pick. It's like, it's like that joke. It's like, Xavier Legette. He could even be a Brandon Ayuk. Like, it's like you're drafting a second-round receiver hoping they reach what Brandon Ayuk basically is now. So that's my view on it. Yeah, I get the contract stuff, but we don't have a franchise QB right now that's extended, at least, as far as we know. So I would not be against trading for a receiver at all before.
Yeah, specifically with Ayuk, I mean, how many guys do you really want to look like Mike Tomlin in the same building? Just saying. I mean, for Steeler fans, if you have not gone out there and looked at Brandon Ayuk in one picture and Mike Tomlin the next, you would think that Brandon Ayuk is his illegitimate son. It's ridiculous, how uncanny those two look alike. But I'm kind of on board with you in the sense that I don't feel like we're going to take a wide receiver in round one. We could upset the apple cart and do that. I just don't think we should. Just considering how deep this year's draft class is, I think you can get a lot of good guys in rounds 2 and 3 that can complement what George Pickens brings to the table, who in reality is our number one wide receiver. And how much more do you really want to piss that kid off? So I think that's part of it. But wide receivers up there as far as big need. Because if George Pickens goes down, I don't know if we have anyone that we could say, yeah, we know we can count on him to catch a few balls. So I mean,
I'll ask you this because, we'll get on this a lot more in the mock draft war room, but, this is definitely worth touching on. As an archetype, and I'll give you examples, do you see us, or would you rather us go more for like a yards after catch guy, physical guy like a Malachi Corley or Xavier Legette, or would you rather us go for more of like a kind of like route running, like Lad McConkey, maybe even like an Xavier Worthy if you want to throw him into that basket? Well, which type of receiver would you rather pair with Pickens?
So there's another question within that. If you ask me, how many receivers do we really need? I think that's the other thing, because I think if we, have this idea that, hey, we need to get 2 receivers, then I say you get one of each. But but just based on your premise, if we're going for more of a true outside guy, personally, I like it when your 1 and your number 2 are bring different things to the table. That's the one thing I liked about Deontay Johnson. What he brought to the table was completely different than what George Pickens brought to the table. So I wouldn't mind having a Lad McConkey, Ricky Pearsall type of wide receiver that can go out there and do everything well, or really do well with the routes and stuff. My only question is, does McConkey profile more as a slot? Because if that's the case, we still could use an outside guy.
Ironically enough, I think Lad McConkey is a lot like Deontay, and he's actually a better straight line athlete than Deontay. Even though he's white, a lot faster than Deontay. But I'll kind of switch this question up. I've thought this for a while. This is why I've wanted kind of like a Jude. I'll say this. I love Juju when he was here. I think he did what we needed to a T. Mm-hmm. He went and caught the dirty balls. He ran hard. He blocked hard. I think he's really underappreciated when he was here. That's kind of where, like you mentioned, like a guy like Ricky Pearsall intrigues me, because I feel like we need a guy, and Pat does it, but Pat has the concussion concerns at this point, where over and like find the soft spot in his zone, not afraid to go make a big catch and get hit. Like, sorry, you got to throw these guys to the wolves sometimes, but it's needed in an offense. And I'm not sure if you can rely on Pat to do that a whole year. So, like I said, Pickens, he beats man in his own way. We know that. Would you rather look at, a snappy route runner like Deontay, which is, different than what George brings, or like a guy who, is going to go find those soft spots in the zone?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I want that snappy route runner. That's just those guys kill. Especially average corners. They make average corners look like they shouldn't even be out there. So I mean, that's the type of guy I want, just because George Pickens brings the vertical, the physicality, the great hands on the other side. If I can have someone that does something completely different but still abuses cornerbacks and that snappy route running, sure-handed stuff, that's what I would prefer personally. Now, I mean, you could definitely go get, like another big physical guy like an AD Mitchell, a Keon Coleman and stuff, but I don't know. I want someone who I know can get open, not just win a contested catch. So that's kind of where I fall.
Okay. And so, it sounds like you're, wide receiver, huge need, but you don't want it round 1. You're thinking round 2, round 3, round 4. Like, how late is too late to address it, do you think?
Well, I think the thing is, I think we need someone who can come in and contribute early. We can't take this 5th and 6th round guy, and just plug him in and hope he works out, because I mean, it's not like we don't have some guys that haven't been around the league. Van Jefferson, he is that kind of bigger outside boundary type wide receiver. You don't expect him to do a whole lot from the slot, especially from the snappy route running stuff that we've come to expect out of that position. He would more actually, if we want to go by our definition of a slot the past few years, he kind of fits that Allen Jefferson, just get in your way and block type of deal, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But, kind of the same thing. Well, and then, Quez Watkins, he's more of a traditional deep threat than anything. He's not a snappy route runner, but again, he profiles as an outside guy who can win with speed and release and stuff like that. But again, hasn't been consistent. He had a dip in his production from last year to the year he had before. So what do we really see in him? So I see the snappy route guy as the guy we need.
Yeah, and there's guys that should be there late. Start looking later in the draft, like maybe like a Cornelius Johnson, kind of like those kinds of 5th or 6th round guys where you can still get a guy who can, not necessarily be a super snappy route runner, but does a lot of things well, and then pick up that snappy route runner early on. How we don't have to go too deep into the weeds on the prospects, but are you, after seeing the Deontay saga and what George Pickens was kind of doing last year, are you scared off by a guy like Jermaine Burton with antics issues, or is it just get a guy if you think he can play?
Yeah, right now it's get a guy if he can play. Yeah. I think the locker room's radically different than what it was the last year. So I think with a better locker room, I think in one, just a better offensive plan in general. I think more guys will kind of fall in line. I think you will see less George Pickens antics when, he has a game where he only catches like 3 or 4 balls versus the past week where he caught 10 or 11. Not going to be the radically different, stuff that we were expecting under, God, I even forgot his name already. What's the name of that guy that we absolutely hated, an offensive coordinator?
The one up north.
Yeah, the one up north. But anyway, we don't have to worry about this off and on crap with Kenny Pickett not reading the play correct and stuff anymore. Hopefully, fingers crossed.
We still might see bailing too soon with Wilson, but at least the ball will get out there. The ball will get out the hands.
Right, exactly. So I don't know. Right now, I'm thinking I just need to add as much talent to that room as possible. I need guys who can challenge the guys we've signed this offseason, because honestly, I mean, Quez Watkins and Van Jefferson, they are not guys that I'm going to be disappointed if they don't make this roster. There are very few guys in the wide receiver room that I'm going to be disappointed with if they don't make this roster outside of George Pickens. So I'm more than anything talent, but we got to have more of it. So that's kind of where I'm at with that. But let's move on to another position now. I think we are on the same page here. As if it's not the first need, it has to be the second. Who the hell is going to snap the ball for the Pittsburgh Steelers this year, Korey? I mean, all we have is Nate Herbig. I believe. So, wow. Normally the Steelers do a pretty good job of like not having such a glaring hole that has to be addressed. Boy, I don't know if they were hoping to maybe sign some of these other centers that went other places or something, but boy, I am concerned about center, and that needs to be a pretty high draft pick.
Mm-hmm. So, the thing with center is going to be there's guys there. There's going to be guys early. There's going to be guys late.
Yeah.
I think, and I don't know, I think that one of the so-called big three, Graham Barton's put himself in that conversation. He snapped as a freshman. Apparently, he's looked great snapping. I'm usually the person who talks against moving guys out of position. Graham Barton can play center. That's not something I'd be upset with.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, little in the prospect feeds, I'm a little more concerned about Jackson Powers-Johnson's ability to consistently snap than Graham Barton. Kind of had issues with it. Senior Bowl, he had some issues with it throughout the season. It's not something that I'm saying he can't do, but the point that I made is that the athletes get bigger and better in the NFL. So that's not something you can just write off as being fixed in the NFL because the blocking gets harder, which is usually, you're trying to fast snapping. But putting that aside, Zach Frazier, Graham Barton, Jackson Powers-Johnson, I think one of those three will be there at, pick 47? Is that our second pick?
No, it's pick 51.
51, that's right. So pick 51, I think one of those will be there. Whether it's, Zach Frazier's concerns coming off the fibula injury or whatever it was, Jackson Powers-Johnson's new medical concerns, Graham Barton not being a tackle but not having a ton of center film. There's warts on all these guys. And I think all of them can play, but I don't think you're going to have to reach for one in the first round. Now, Will loves Hunter Norzad. I like him too. That's Penn State center.
Yep.
I'm a fan of Kingsley Igwakun out of Florida later. There's, Tanner Bortolini, who ran that absurd three-cone.
Mm-hmm.
Jalen Sundell from NDSU could play in there. I like him.
Van Pran from Georgia.
Yes, I didn't even mention Cedric Van Pran. He was in that original top three. He's kind of fallen out of favor a little. He can play. I think he could be a starter, year one, which is what we need because we don't have anyone else.
Yeah, I mean, this is whatever center gets drafted is going to get the Maurkice Pouncey treatment. Like, get up there, Rook. We need you.
My point of view on it, I think the highest upside is probably Graham Barton. He's the guy I'd be most surprised if he got to that second pick. I feel like if Graham Barton ends up on the Steelers, it's some form of trade back or trade up where we go into more of that 30 to 40 range. Zach Frazier is probably the most sound thing you get, but he's probably the worst scheme fit for getting these centers super far on the move, super fast out of their stance, because Jackson Powers-Johnson and Graham Barton can fly out of their stance. Zach Frazier is not, slow, but he's not, that typical super high RAS score center that I'm blanking on his name, Arthur Smith, has taken every single year. So, that's where a guy like Tanner Bortolini might come back into the picture with looking at RAS scores and stuff like that. But where my gut tells me right now, even with the West Coast stuff, I have a feeling Jackson Powers-Johnson slips because of the knee medical concerns and all that stuff. We showed last year that we're willing to ignore that with Darnell. We traded back up for him. My guess is that I think we probably get him at 51 due to the medicals. And then, people are ecstatic. I'm going to say, he's a good blocker. He's fast. He's physical. Just be wary of the snap issues. That's something we know all too well from.
For Mason? Yeah.
And Mason. Everyone since. And even Pouncey went out with a horrific snapping game. So we really have a while. But that's kind of my view on center. I know Will loves Norzad. If we're waiting on Norzad, I'm going to be waiting on Norzad. I'll be sweating it a little, if I'm being honest, because that's a weird dead zone of picks where it feels like he could go anywhere.
Yeah, you mentioned a good thing about Powers-Johnson potentially slipping. There's been some rumors, just some talk out there, that while the media loves these centers, that it's still center. A lot of teams don't consider it a premium position that a guy like him could fall. Really, all these centers could fall a little bit, which honestly why the trade back sounds, great, if you really wanted to.
Until we get to our next position, but I'm sure we'll talk about that.
Yeah. I will say I read something this week that the Cowboys are very high in Zach Frazier, and I'm going to go ahead and put this out there now. This is kind of my shot. You put one out there, about Matt Wright maybe potentially replacing Boswell down the line. I'm going to go out on a limb and say Zach Frazier is the first center drafted. They threw everyone off a few years ago when they traded up for, I think it was Frederick.
Tyler, did they trade up for Tyler Smith too, or did they just take him?
They might have traded up for him, but I just more meant like specifically for center.
Yeah.
Whatever. It would not surprise me if the Cowboys surprise everyone and take Frazier, at pick 24. Anyway, just throwing that out there.
I don't think I talked about it last draft cycle. No need to. I love Zach Frazier last draft cycle. I said he's better than John Michael Schmitz, and I would still take him above where John Michael Schmitz was, even with the fibula injury. I think his film is spectacular. I think that the reason I have a slight hold up for him on the Steelers is that the zone, like the fit isn't perfect, because he's a super good pass protector, super physical, gets the seals on gap schemes, really good at moving inside zone. Outside zone's probably the aspect of his game, and it's not bad, but just looking at the fit, it's the worst fit out of the three centers. But he's been my number one center. Barton's right there with him. Then Jackson a little farther behind. But I'm with you. I have a feeling he doesn't get there. I think that Graham Barton probably gets taken. The problem with Barton is he's a guard and a center, and he had good tackle film.
Fair you say, potentially a tackle.
Yeah, so that's a guy where, even if some teams see him as a guard, well, shit, he's still got to get the pick 51. Like, there's a lot more hurdles to jump through. That's why, with the rumors of the medicals of Jackson Powers Johnson, the obvious need, that's my guess. If not, I could see Norzad later. But I don't think Frazier or Barton make it to the second pick. So unless we have a trade back or trade up, I don't see us getting either of those two.
Yeah, that's my number one concern. I can't tell you how many times I've been on a mock draft simulator hoping that one of those centers would fall to pick 51, and it never happens. So I guess that's my biggest concern is I don't want to miss out on a day one starter at center. Just because need it in the worst way possible. But let's move on. And Korey, I'm going to let you go with here because I'm interested in what you think is the next biggest need of this team.
I'm confident. There's two for me here. It's nickel and tackle.
Okay.
We talk about tackle just because we were just kind of talking about trading back and trading up. I think the number one thing that's an issue in this draft is that we need 3 picks in the first 2 rounds, and we have 2. And the issue with that is that, we would love to, because how everything looks, there are 8 first-round tackles, which is kind of crazy if you include Fatanu as a tackle. Mm-hmm. And 8th one is Amarius Mims, who gets some buzz going to the Bengals at the pick right before us, isn't it, in the first round?
The pick 18, and then the Rams right before us with 19.
Yeah, so there's buzz with Amarius Mims going basically right before us. But if you trade back, he's not making it there. Mm-hmm. And I have opinions on Amarius Mims where I'm a little iffy on the injury concern, but if you want a starting tackle early, you're basically going to have to stand pat, and then you're sacrificing either receiver or center in the next round. And that's if center even gets there. So that's kind of the issue with tackle at the moment where, you want to replace Dan Moore, but you're pretty much landlocked into taking someone if you want to get Dan Moore off, especially day one.
Yeah, and unfortunately, Steeler fans, I think we're stuck with Dan Moore. Unless we just, take Mims at pick 20 if he's there. Or maybe if we trade down slightly and get a guy like Guyton. I'm actually a bigger Guyton fan. I think than most people. I think he can really go out there and play. Just get his athleticism's off the charts. and everything. But I'm totally on board with you, man. Yeah, offensive tackle, huge need. And we have plenty of guys who can play outside corner. We don't have anyone that can play nickel. I mean, there's a litany of guys who I think can play nickel in this draft, but, where they go is always the question, So what are your thoughts on, where nickel corner gets addressed? If we're throwing offensive tackle in there too, because, I mean, with our first 4 picks, and they're all top 100, we found a way to do that, with the Kenny Pickett trade and everything. I would love to take a receiver, a nickel corner, an offensive tackle, and a center. But
so I've been a Mike Sainristil super fan again since last year, and that's the guy. If I could throw out a little BS mock draft. If we came out of this with like Amarius Mims, Jackson Powers Johnson, Ricky Pearsall, and Mike Sainristil, that'd be phenomenal. Mm-hmm. That's throwing darts. There's a good chance none of those guys are at the picks that they are. But, I think that there's, Javon Bullard, I think, is a slot more than a safety. I think he could slide down. I think he could do pretty well there. Then you've got, honestly, just a litany of guys who can play there between the corner types. You've got Renardo Green, Jerrion Jones, Daquan Hardy, A.J. Woods, M.J. Devonshire, Tyke Smith, Cam Pedescalo. He's a guy that I'm a big fan of.
And the Tulane kid?
Yes.
Yeah.
And there's Jarius Monroe, who could also probably play there. Then, if we go crazy, take like a Nate Wiggins in the first. He's probably a slot corner with us. Tackling's a little shaky. But there are Jarvis Brownlee Jr., another guy. There are so many guys who could play in the slot that I'm not, upset if we miss out on one in the top 100 just because there's that many there. Ideally, we get Mike Sainristil. I think he's probably a top 5 slot player in the league as soon as he's drafted. I think he's that good. And teams often cheap out on the slots like the Steelers have the past bunch of years. But that's one where I'm not as worried about because, if you get like a Renardo Green in the 4th round, that's a hell of a pick. You get an A.J. Woods in the 6th. That guy had one of the best testings ever, and his film's good. He's a pick guy. So, there's a lot of smoke there. So, I'm not as concerned about nickel. I think if we don't take one at some point throughout the draft, I think it's a big mistake, though, because those guys go like candy in the 6th and 7th round. You saw it with like Christian Izien with the Bucks being on him. I think you might have liked him too, if I recall.
I did.
It's those guys go in the 6th and 7th because teams aren't getting to UDFA anymore. What's kind of your thoughts on the slot situation? Because right now we have Kazee, Darius Rush, Deshaun Elliott who can go there. That's not an inspiring list. So you'd imagine something gets addressed.
Yeah, I'm kind of on board with you though. There's a lot of guys in this draft that can play it. That could be our pick at 119 in the 4th. There could be a myriad of those nickel guys there. Honestly, the guy I'm probably a little higher. I'm not saying that he's above Mike Sainristil, but I think he's on the same level. You mentioned him. Jerrion Jones, I love that kid. He's got the right mentality. That's the other part, too. You need someone in there with the right mentality. That guy is physical, super athletic. That's kind of my dream scenario for round 4 right now is, a really talented nickel being there. Just because I do feel like we need to take a second wide receiver at some point. So as crazy as that is. So with everything we've mentioned. So I'm on board with you. I think the nickel run starts in round 3 somewhere, How early does a guy like Sainristil go? That's going to be the tipping point of, those type of corners going. Does a guy like Max Melton potentially play in the slot, or is he potentially just an outside guy? Because he's one of my favorites. I'm not going to lie. Big Max.
I think he goes too early as an outside corner to be a lot like pick for us later, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of? I just hope we address it. it could. There's a million guys that I could be that talked into because slots. It's kind of like pick your flavor. Some are real sticky in coverage. We could use that. Some are more physical but need a little help in coverage. We could use that. Like we need all of it. But it's just more. I just want us to address it more than anything else. I just can't go another year. Go shout out Quantez Stiggers. He can play. Like the Argonaut out of the CFL.
Argonaut. That sounds funny when you actually say it out loud.
One that I have 2 more spots or 3 more spot positions that I figured we'll address at some point. Lower priority positions. But one I didn't mention, I just want to mention, like one I didn't list that I want to say. There's some serious concern, and I've talked about this so much that I almost forgot to talk about it on the podcast. I say Amalo is not a good outside zone blocker. He never has.
Okay.
He's a poor outside zone blocker. And that I would be very shocked if we address guard in the draft this year at all, even late. That would just surprise me. I could see us trying to maybe UDFA guy that hope maybe sticks. But Nick Herbig isn't either. So our backup's not an outside zone guy. Or Nate. One of the offensive guard Herbig.
Yeah.
Isaac Seumalo is not an outside zone guy. It wouldn't surprise me if he didn't look very good this year, and everyone's kind of like, oh, what happened? It's just the scheme. He wasn't good at all with it in Philly. He wasn't good with it when we ran it in Pittsburgh last year. It's pretty on the record that Isaac Seumalo is not good at blocking outside zone, which now we might potentially run over 100 times more than the next closest team, most popular run concept in the NFL.
Right. But since we're talking about the trenches, let's flip it to the other side.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, defensive line, I think we have a lot of issues there, actually. Cameron Hayward, been a freaking warrior. Salute to you, sir. Congratulations on winning Walter Payton Man of the Year. Considered, the NFL's probably most prestigious honor one could have, outside of being a Super Bowl champion.
Mm-hmm.
He's getting up there in age. Larry Ogunjobi can never stay healthy for a full year. Keanu Benton looked very good as a rookie. I'll give him that. But, boy, I'm not sold on our depth. I know Loudermilk had a slightly better year, than the year before. But, again, a marginal player at this point in his career. Montravius Adams, who we re-signed, again, marginal player. Dean Lowry was a good player on his last legs, too. We really need to add, some talent to the defensive line group. And the question is where? We have all these other, big time needs, and it's like, man, our defensive line could get really thin at any point this year.
I've got a pretty firm view on this. I think, yes, it's depth, but I'm looking at it more the lens of we need a Cam Hayward replacement. He is on his last legs. Had a bit of a second win towards the end of the year. I remember I shit-talked him a little when he was injured and said that we might not miss him that bad. And we really didn't, but he played a lot better than he was at the beginning of the year towards the end. So that kind of knocks off 0 and 1 techs. I think they want Benton. I think they want to be athletic in there at the 0 and 1 tech. We've had numerous chances to take that kind of type in previous years. It's just not an interest of ours. So as much as we might like to take a slipping Tavondre Sweat, which is probably going to happen.
Yeah.
Not just surprised. I'd be shocked if we took him just based off of past draft strategies. That kind of point leaves us to guys like, Mason Smith, Makai Wingo, who's a little undersized. Tyler Davis is a little short. But we both love him. You got him in both our drafts. So I'm going to toss the baton to you. I would love Gabe Hall with one of those early day 3 picks.
Yeah, but and just for reference to your fans, that is a prospect defensive tackle out of Baylor. If you're not familiar with him, he's 6'6", hovering right around the 300-pound range, and boy, he's a bull. You just don't move him. And he's got some pass rushing upside. I don't think he'll ever be, fantastic or whatever, but he's a high effort player, which I think is the one of the most underrated things people look for in defensive prospects right now. Everyone's all about talent, talent, talent. This guy has talent and the right work ethic. That's why he was high on my board. I sniped him a few times from Korey in our mock draft exercises, most likely. He's definitely a guy.
I'll even add on to that. So on his film, I thought the same thing. Not much of a pass rusher. He's got some juice, not like something that's like eye catching, but he played a lot of 5-tech and like 4-eye with Baylor. When he was at the Senior Bowl in like more standard alignments and like a 3 and a 1-tech where he's kind of cocked a little, even when he was just head up on the center. Something with the matchup, something with his arsenal, something with his size. He was tearing linemen up at the Senior Bowl. And he looked like he had an arsenal. He had a really nice swim. He had an outside spin on a guard. I mean, he has a good long arm and a good bull rush. I think there's, a lot of pass rushing juice there. I think my guess is he goes higher than some of these boards list him. The size, plus he tested pretty well, plus like his Senior Bowl showing would all lead me to assume he's higher. But that's like the dream pick for me. Like he's probably one of the only guys like towards the back end of the draft that I'd be like disappointed if we missed him, even though the chance is so small of us, wanting to take him and all that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, do you potentially see the Steelers drafting a defensive lineman early, or do you think it will be a late run option? Because I think there's a lot of really intriguing guys that could be there on day 2, like a Braden Fisk from Florida State, a Ruko or Hororo, I think I said that right, out of Clemson. Michael Hall's getting a lot of love out of Ohio State as one of those very twitchy interior rushers. Chris Jenkins, a guy I really like is Leonard Taylor out of Miami. I think he's going to be a much better pro than he was a college player. But
yeah, so I'll give Steelers Depot credit on this one because they have a very precise checklist of D linemen that the Steelers will pretty much take in the draft. And this guy has checked every single box I think you could imagine for a guy in pre-draft, where he checks it's arm length, height, weight, athleticism scores, pedigree, which we always know is a big thing for them coming out, like pedigree out of high school, which conference they're in, meetings, who was at their pro day, all this stuff. I mentioned earlier, like Mason Smith checks every single box that they have for a prospect. So, I mean, we talked about how it's not that out of the realm of possibility that we don't get a tackle. We just roll with Dan Moore, maybe take a developmental guy like a Travis Glover later. I know Will loves him. Yeah, he's at State, but I could easily see us taking Mason Smith with like that 3rd pick, even if it's a little bit of a reach, because that's like I said, Steelers Depot, their checklist on D-line's pretty spot on every year. They've usually got a list of 5 or 6 guys who meet the boxes, and then Mason Smith meets those, plus has the visits and all this stuff. I don't think it would be a bad pick. I think he was underwhelming in college, but, I mean, he's got, comparisons to Stephon Tuitt, which is intriguing, to say the least. So, I mean, 6'5", 306, not as big as Gabe Hall, which we love. That's the guy I kind of keep on the radar. It seems like we're staying away from 0 techs. Techs usually 3s can bump over, so I'm not really too worried about making that distinction. But my prediction, I say we take at least 1 D lineman. I wouldn't be floored if we took a second, like in the later rounds either, like later, like 6th or 7th.
Yeah, that's why I'm personally like really high on Rook or Horororo. I can't say it, but he's still raw. He was raw coming out of high school. When I was with IU, he was actually coming to play for IU until Clemson came in late and snagged him. We were devastated, when that kid left to go to Clemson, because we knew he was good. We knew this was a kid that needed some coaching or whatever. But I think the ironic thing is, you could still argue that he's still pretty raw. So I love just the size profile. He's 6'4", plays in that 300-pound range. I'm not sure on
Super long arms, I think.
Yeah, it's very safe. I mean, the dude is just unreal athletically. Because if we're truly aiming for a Cam Hayward replacement, we need someone who's going to hold up against the run, but also be able to get after the passer. That has been an underrated part of Cam Hayward's game, and it's not like he wins with like exceptional quickness and stuff. He just overpowers people. So we could use an overpowering type of guy, and a guy like our Horror fits that to a T.
He's got a bunch of welcome to the NFL moments from some young O-linemen with that forklift move that he has, that long arm bull rush kind of stab that he does. I think it's been at least 3 or 4 where I've seen, young offensive linemen talk about, that was I just couldn't stop it.
Yeah. But, the position is so thin, and it's like we have got to start thinking long-term at that position because to begin this offseason, we all thought the Hayward contract was going to be one of the most prohibitive things of having a, functioning offseason. And, the Steelers did various different things of cutting people, the Deontay trade, freeing up money where we didn't have to touch his contract. But, I do think this is his last year. So looking for his replacement is not outside the woodshed. So I mean, are there any other needs that are truly glaring to you? I feel like we've touched on all of the needs where it's like, those absolutely have to get addressed this cycle.
I have 2 that are ones that I'd like to see.
Okay.
The first one is a little lessened with the Cordarrelle Patterson signing. It's a running back who can run outside zone. I said before, running back's not a obvious need. Obviously, we have one of the better back tandems in the NFL. But if neither of them can run the offense that we would like to run, it'd be nice to have one young guy who can. But I think that's going to turn into us taking a guy, or not doing like an undrafted free agency, just throwing out, there's a couple guys. There's, Michael White,
Yeah, there's always some late round backs that
late running backs that can do what you ask them to do.
Mm-hmm.
But the one that still I'd like to be addressed, and it might be asking for a bit because it is a thin position group. I would like to see a coverage linebacker added to the roster, and there are not many of those in this draft class right now.
No,
so,
they're on.
Catch your eye anywhere in the draft, or?
I think my problem is the guys I like are all early round guys. That they aren't going to be those, late round stabs. In the Steelers, before we signed Patrick Queen, we're flirting with a guy like an Edgerrin Cooper. So it's like that made sense before we signed Patrick Queen, but now that we've signed Patrick Queen, I just can't see the linebacker being such an early position. Like they would just have to be an outstanding value. I can speak on one guy who Will and I actually have him as our top linebacker, our top inside linebacker. I'm pretty sure, and I feel bad if Will it doesn't feel this way, but I thought we were on a consensus on this. We both love Trevin Wallace out of Kentucky. The dude's just a great linebacker, super athletic, can fly around, do a lot of things. Can improve in coverage for sure. All these guys can. But if there's one guy, if we went and said we want a linebacker and we need to pound our hand on a table, Trevin Wallace out of Kentucky would be my guy. And then Cedric Gray, a lot of people don't like him as much for some reason. I don't know why, but he's kind of a guy I've seen play a good portion over these last 2 years and thought, I can see that translating really well to Sunday. But
I've frowned on Cedric Gray a little bit more. I don't think he'll fall to where it would make sense to take him.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I've banged on the table on other draft podcasts for this guy. I am a massive Tatum Bethune fan. I think very, 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 very slept on. I think he's probably the best coverage backer in the class.
Wow.
Yeah. I think, because, you see guys who can play in zone. There's a handful of guys who are comfortable in zone, can get to their drops. I think what impresses me with Bethune is that he looks really, twitchy and bursty when he's in which is a trait that you usually, those linebackers tend to kind of get stuck in the mud a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But, and he's not just a coverage guy. Like Lavelle Bailey out of Fresno State can cover his ass off, but he's kind of a non-factor in the run. You can't have that as a linebacker. You just can't carry a spot for that. But Tatum Bethune, he'll come down and he'll, get his nose dirty. He'll go and, try and lay someone out. Does it always result in clean tackles? No. But, he's a big hitter. And that's kind of what comes with the territory. So if it's a big hitter who can cover, you can get me on board for that. But Tatum Bethune's my guy, will be my guy. That's a guy that I hope we take late.
I might have to go back and watch a little bit more of him. I thought he was more of a run guy, so I'll have to go back there and try to isolate some coverage snaps for him. But
yeah, he gets blitzed a decent bit, so you kind of got to hunt for him. But the coverage reps when they're there, that's kind of made me raise my hand. The thing is they had Deloach also, who is 5'11", 215. So when you have a guy like that, Bethune is your, Lawrence Timmons in that linebacker pairing. Like he's not the small one, even though he is 5'11", 225. He's not a huge backer. But yeah, I could see, like I mentioned, I'm guard maybe later.
Yeah.
But not safety later, but that's really it for me. There's areas they can go. The main issues with this draft is we have at least 3 big needs, a fourth that could be fixed later, but only 2 premium picks for, quote unquote guaranteed starters.
Yeah. But as it seems like that's been the problem with the last few drafts for the Steelers, the lack of, draft picks panning out. I hate to say it, but Kevin Colbert left the barrel there. It sucks because, he did such a good job for such a long time, but his last few drafts kind of put this team in a hole, in a sense. So, but, that's the offseason in a nutshell, Steeler fans. We've got a lot more content coming at you here. Any other needs before I kind of wrap it up? I feel like we've talked about every single one we could possibly think of.
A win in the playoffs.
A win in the playoffs. Yep, we're still hunting for that. So, thank you for joining us for part 1 of many to come on the Steeler Fury Draft Extravaganza. We covered our offseason and our needs. Looking forward here. Be on the lookout for more content coming soon from myself, from Korey, from Will, as Bradshaw to Ben, and some others that are going to be helping us out in this Draft Extravaganza podcast series.
Steelers